Hello, this is Michelle with Simply Scape Handmade, and today we're going to take a look at stitching together the pieces of our quilt block in our spring picnic quilt. Before we get started, I'm going to scooch over here to the cutting table where you can see that I have my rows laid out. Because two of the rows are repeating, they're the same, I have my rows on top of each other. So just to save space, we have, this is one row and this is one row. And since the layouts are similar, I just have them on top of each other. I don't know that that's clear, but that's the purpose of that. Now, when I quilt and when I stitch, I work top to bottom, left to right. So when I get started, I'm going to start with this piece. So I'm going to take this one and note that the lines are going horizontally here, like the horizon, and the piece beside it will be a vertical block. So one thing to keep yourself in check when you're working, you'll notice that one piece will always be going vertically or horizontally, and the neighboring piece will be a vertical piece. So we just take the first block and the second block, put them on top of each other, right sides together. As we scooch over here to the machine, I kind of want to point something out. Some people like to pin their blocks, and I'm not a pinner by nature. I generally just kind of put them together and stitch. When I do feel that I need a little extra help, I don't use a pin. Instead, I use these little hair clips. I don't know if you can see this. It's just a little things that our grandmothers would use to pin their hair at night when it was wet, or they would pin rollers with them. I like them because they don't put holes in the fabric, they don't scrunch up the fabric, and there is very, very little risk of me running over one of these with my sewing machine, breaking a needle. So if you are a pinner, go ahead and start by pinning the side that you're going to stitch together. You just want to make sure that your ends are closed, your right sides together, and that you're ready to go. So get all that stuff scooched over. Again, I am using my 1/4 inch or 1/4 inch seam guided foot if you have one. If not, you'll have your little seam guide or stitch guide on the side. It can be as simple as a rubber band or a piece of tape. My bobbin's full, and I've got a neutral colored thread. I generally will use just a cream colored quilting thread. I use it for machine quilting, hand quilting, and piecing. So I stick with a neutral color, and I pretty much stick with the same thread whether I'm piecing or stitching. Not all people do that. It's just a matter of preference for me. Before we go too far, I'm going to answer a question. Sometimes you will hear the term headers and footers or something like that, and what that means is when you're piecing, some people will run a strip of fabric through the needle first, and they will follow it with what they're actually piecing. And that's because sometimes the machine will bunch up, or you may have a stitch error, or your bobbin might be having problems. So this is kind of just a check and see how it's going before you get going. And then oftentimes they will do the same thing at the very end. When they get to the end of the piece, they will run that piece underneath as well. And it's to prevent bunching, it's to check stitches. I've really never used them myself unless I was piecing a fabric that tended to seem to kind of get stuck or caught up here under the foot. I personally just get going. But if you are having trouble with your machine kind of bunching up here at the top or at the bottom, or if it just seems more logical and comfortable for you, go ahead and use just a little scrap piece of fabric before you get going. As we stitch, again, we want to maintain consistency and evenness as we work along the piece. The goal is to simply maintain as much as possible the same stitch allowance and a nice even feed. One thing you might notice is right here on the underside, if you have been really consistent in ironing down those seam allowances in one direction, it will be a lot easier, because if they're all going in the same direction, you won't have any problem with them flipping over or kind of getting caught on the feed track when you're working on the stitching. We're going to do the same thing with these blocks that we did with the strips, in that once our stitching is finished, we're going to take it over to the iron. We're going to give a nice setting of that seam with the iron, and then we will press it open. And I would stay consistent. So when you look here, the seams here are all going in this direction, so I'm going to press that in that direction as well. And that way when I'm quilting, either by hand or by machine, those seam allowances are going in the same direction, and it will make it easier for me to work on, because you don't really want to try putting the needle through all of this fabric. You would be working more likely right here. And if they're all going the same direction, then it's really easy to realize where that is. Alright, when we get it all pressed and pieced and ready, then we're going to add that next piece to it. And realizing that it goes like this. The first block over here, the stitches are going horizontally, and this one is vertical. So the very next block that we pick up, we want to make sure is another horizontal block. And we just want to put them right sides together. Remember, pin if you're comfortable with that, and use a header and footer if you're more comfortable with that. And also, if it is possible, and when it is possible, make sure those seam allowances are going toward you. They're laying flat to go underneath those feed dogs. If they're not, then the thing to do, or what I do, is I take my seam ripper. Some machines come with what's called a stylus, and basically all it is a use for guide, to guide that thicker fabric underneath. And what you would do is when you're stitching, if you're having trouble when you get under there, if you have trouble with the seam allowance, you would just kind of push it down and guide it as it works underneath. Many people do that. I personally try really hard to ensure that my stitch allowances are facing down and are going under at a smooth rate. But if they're not, if you end up with your layout, the pieces facing the feed dogs, then just simply use something, whether it's your seam ripper or the stylus that came with your machine. Just use that to kind of lay it down and keep it flat while it's going under there, and that'll help with the bunching issue. I hope this tutorial has been helpful. Right now I'm going to go stitch the rest of my rows together, and then we'll meet in another video to put all of the quilt top together and get it ready for basting.